I want to tell you about a question. 3 words, ordinary ones. They could pass in any room without anyone noticing they'd been said. Are you sure? I've watched questions do a great deal of work from this wall, but I've rarely seen 3 words do what these 3 did. To this person, in this room, on an ordinary evening when nothing looked like it was happening. The coat had been heavy for years by then, you'll remember. The weight arrived gradually. There was no single morning I could point to. The person inside it had become someone I recognized less and less. The anger that came too fast, the room inside them that had narrowed, the certainty that felt like clarity but wasn't. They were still coming through that door, still hanging the coat, still sitting in the same chair. From the outside, nothing much had changed, but I knew what I was looking for. And I knew something else by then. I knew the weight hadn't just been placed in them once, years ago, and left to settle. It was being topped up every evening through the phone in their hand. The person who asked, "Are you sure?" had known them a long time. That matters. The question wasn't asked by a stranger or someone with a point to argue or someone who needed to be right. It was asked by someone who'd been in this room alongside them for years, who'd shared the ordinary friction of it, who had been watching something change and had finally found the moment, or the courage, or both, to say the thing. They weren't arguing. They weren't presenting a counter case. They weren't pointing at evidence or citing sources or explaining where the other person had gone wrong. They simply shared something first, something with emotional resonance from their own life, something that had cost them something to say. And then, the way someone pauses when they're genuinely curious, they asked, "Are you sure about that?" A beat. Really sure? Another beat. Longer. Really sure? Not unkind, not a challenge. A hand held out, very quietly, toward a gap that had been closed for a long time. The person could have reached for the phone. They usually did. Any question this direct, any moment this uncomfortable, the screen was there, in reach, ready to supply the answer before they had to sit with the question. That's what it was built to do. But they didn't reach for it. Maybe the person who asked was close enough that using the phone would have been a kind of walking out. Maybe the presence of someone actually in the room briefly outweighed the pull of the device in the pocket. I can't tell you the mechanism. I can only tell you what I watched. The phone stayed where it was, and the question sat in the air. What happened wasn't an argument. It wasn't a conversion. It wasn't the moment someone said, "You're right, I've been wrong, everything's different now." Those moments don't happen in rooms like this. And when they seem to, I've learned not to trust them. Real change is slower and quieter and doesn't announce itself. What happened was a pause. The person sat with the question, and I watched the certainty do something I hadn't seen it do in years. It flickered. A hairline crack in something that had been solid for so long that neither of them remembered it was ever anything else. The person didn't say much. Something non-committal, changed the subject. The evening continued the way evenings continue. Unremarkably, without resolution, the way most important things actually happen. But something had shifted. A gap had opened, just enough. And once a gap opens, a question gets in. Is this true? The gap is where that question lives. And the people who manufactured the fear understood something important about the gap. A question that gets in before the certainty settles is a question that can undo the whole structure. So the gap is the target. Close it fast enough, confirm the story often enough, keep the screen in the person's hand long enough, and the question never forms. What arrives feels like something they always knew. The gap had been closed in this person for years. Now, because someone who knew them well had shared something and asked a simple question without needing to win, and because the phone had stayed in the pocket long enough for the question to do its work, it was open again. And the question that got in wasn't comfortable. The question that got in was, what if I've been wrong? Not about everything, not in every direction, but about this. About the face the fear had been given, about the certainty that had felt like clarity, about the picture of the world assembled not from the world itself, but from sources that were always, at every point in the chain, pointing in the same direction. What if the thing I was most sure of was the thing I should have questioned first? I watched this happen across days and then weeks. Not a transformation. A person who had started quietly to pull at a thread, to go back to what they'd been told and ask where it came from, to look at the sources and then the sources of the sources, to notice, with a growing unease that was entirely their own, that the ground was less solid than it had felt. The phone came out less, not because they'd decided to use it less, because when you start asking where something came from, the thing that was delivering the answers becomes part of the question. The feed looked different once they'd started noticing the pattern, everything pointing the same way. The alarm arriving every few minutes, the certainty always just confirmed, never checked. They didn't stop reading it, not yet, but they started seeing it. And then one day, the ground wasn't solid at all. I don't know exactly when the house fell, when the veil lifted. I only know what I saw when they came through the door afterward. The coat came in differently, not lighter, not yet, but differently. The weight wasn't the dense, pointed weight of certainty anymore. It was the weight of someone who has just found out they've been somewhere they didn't intend to go, and is working out how far back the wrong turn was. That's a different kind of heavy, harder in some ways, but navigable in a way the other kind wasn't. What came next, I wasn't prepared for. The shame. It arrived before anything else, before the anger, before the questions, just shame. Quiet and specific and entirely their own. Not placed there by anyone, not manufactured, not delivered through a channel. Grown, the way earned fear grows, from actual contact with something real. They had believed what they'd been served for years. They'd said things in this room that I'd heard, things that had landed on people in ways nobody mentioned, but I'd watched. Things that couldn't be unsaid now that the ground had shifted. The shame was appropriate. I'm not going to tell you otherwise, but the shame is the proof that the person underneath was always still there. You can't feel ashamed of something you did if you've lost all connection to who you were before you did it. The shame is, in its way, the return. It hurts in the specific way return hurts. The recognition of the distance traveled, the cost of the journey, the way things look different from here than they did from there. But it's return. And return, however uncomfortable, is the right direction. The anger came after. This anger was different from the one I'd been watching arrive too fast, too hot for years. That anger had a face that was wrong. This anger had a face that was right. Someone had looked at this person, at their genuine difficulty, their real uncertainty, the actual weight of a life that had been harder than it should have been, and understood the difficulty as an opportunity. Someone had packed a fear into them deliberately, because a person carrying that fear was more useful than a person without it. And they'd carried it for years without knowing it had been packed by someone else. The anger at that is legitimate, the correct response. Not the performed anger of the feed, not the pointed anger of received fear. The quiet, cold anger of someone who has understood for the first time what was actually done to them. That anger doesn't need a face from outside the room. It knows exactly where to look. And then something else, something quietly significant. They started asking the question everywhere. Not just about this, about everything that arrived looking like information. About the story that made them feel alarmed, about the source and the source of the source, and who benefits if this is believed. About the thing designed to travel fast, to land in the gap before the question could form, to feel like knowledge rather than delivery. The phone was the first place they asked it, because by then they could see what it had been doing. Not always, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to pause before scrolling. Enough to ask, sometimes, where did this come from? And who benefits if I believe it? The manufacturer had taught them, without meaning to, exactly how to see the manufacture. That's the ladder, not the whole climb, not the whole way out. The darkness doesn't lift all at once. The shame doesn't resolve. The years don't disappear because the ground shifted. Anyone who tells you the climb is easy is either selling something or hasn't made it themselves. But a ladder doesn't need to reach the top to be worth climbing. It just needs to take you far enough that you can see light above you. Far enough that up becomes a direction again. That's what the question does. Are you sure? Who told you? Who benefits if you believe it? It doesn't fix anything. It doesn't undo what was believed or what was said while it was believed, but it gets you off the floor. And from off the floor, the room looks different. The ceiling that felt like the sky starts to look like what it is. Something to climb past, not something to live under. The question is the first rung. Once you've learned to ask it, you can't unlearn it. The gap, once reopened, doesn't close the same way again. Question everything. Question it all. The manufacture is louder now than it's ever been. The channels are everywhere. The device in the pocket never stops. Which means the question, are you sure? Who told you? Who benefits? Matters more than it ever has. Not as a habit of suspicion, as a habit of care. For yourself, for the room. The coat is lighter now. Not light. The weight of what was believed and for how long, and what was said while it was believed, that doesn't lift entirely. The shame doesn't vanish. The anger doesn't resolve. But the coat is lighter. I can feel it when it arrives. The difference between the weight of something carried and the weight of something that's been, at least partly, set down. And last week, someone new came through that door. Young, visibly uncertain. The room did what rooms do. Conversations found their existing channels and stayed in them, the way water finds the path it already knows. And this person, the one whose coat I've held through all of it, crossed the room, sat down next to the newcomer, put the phone in their pocket, and stayed there. I noticed. I don't think anyone else did, but I did. It's always something quieter than the argument. A question asked without needing to win. A phone that stayed in the pocket long enough for something honest to get through. A gap held open long enough for something honest to move through it. A person who learned the hard way at real cost in their own time to ask, "Are you sure?" before they let certainty settle into something heavier. And then, when the time came, did the same for someone else. The room, simply being a room, undoes the manufactured work. It usually does. I'll still be here when you get back.